to my channel. I'm Rachel, the owner and creator here at the Eclectic Cottage in Spokane, Washington. Happy Saturday, everyone. As you can tell, I did not quite get my video finished in time for Friday, but here we are, and I do have some projects for you. I completed 3 DIYs with some wood scraps out of my stash. I hope you guys like them as much as I do, and without further ado, let's get to today's video. My first scrap wood project for today is going to be a sign using this thin old piece of wood that I had in my stash. I'm pretty sure is the bottom of an old magazine rack that I disassembled. I am starting by using some milk paint. So I'm going over it with a couple of coats of Sweet Pickins milk paint. This color is called Creamy. And since I was hoping to get a little bit of crackle or maybe some chippiness, I left the extra bond out of my paint. In between my coats, so this is just after I finished my first coat, I went over it with my hair dryer to just give it a little bit of heat and hopefully encourage some of that chippiness. And then as soon as I was done with that, I went over it with a second coat of the milk paint and then hit it again with some heat. I did end up getting a little bit of crackling doing that. Then I flipped it over and did the back side as well. Not too worried about getting chippiness or crackle here. And you can see I added water to my paint because it was getting kind of thick from sitting, and I thinned it out just a little too much. So it took me like 4 coats of this very thin paint to get the back looking like I wanted it to. Once my paint was completely dry, I'm going in with some sandpaper to make sure everything's smooth and also to knock off any chips that might have formed. So for the back, I just went over it with 220 grit sandpaper, and then on the front, I used a little heavier grit at 120 just to see if I could get anything knocked off, which I did a little bit. Then I got everything cleaned back up again and ready for some stenciling. A couple years ago, I purchased an entire set of stencils from Amazon, so I'm using one of those to make this sign. Now, of course, my board wasn't quite wide enough for the entire stencil, so I taped off the portions that I didn't want to use, leaving me with just the words, and then I began the stenciling process. For my color, I am using DIY's Weathered Wood, which is a beautiful kind of rich dark brown with just a little bit of gray in it, and a little stencil brush, and I'm just kind of pouncing and swirling that paint down into my stencil until I have my letters completely filled in. I go over it 2 or 3 times just to make sure everything is nice and dark before I remove my stencil. And the final step in this project is to seal my paint. And for that, I'm going to use a spray sealer. This is Rust-Oleum Clear Matte Spray, just so that I don't accidentally smudge any of my letters. And once that's done, my little sign is finished. My second scrap wood project is going to be utilizing some pieces of an old 2x4. These are cut to 8, 11, and 14 inches, and then the corners are all rounded. I use these to create what I call my tall pumpkin block sets. I had created a few sets a couple of years ago, and I recently sold the last one, so it was time to make some more. Luckily, I had already pre-cut 4 sets of boards, so I grabbed out 2 of those sets for today's video, and this is the first set. I am starting by painting the 4 narrow ends of the board plus one of the flat sides in this beautiful gray color. This one's called Gravel Road by DIY. Now, I know for a lot of you, it's a bit of a shock to see me paint something gray. It's not a color I use very often. However, the decoupage paper that I want to use on the front sides of these has a gray background, and this particular color matches it almost perfectly. Once I was finished painting my gray portions, I moved on to painting the sides that I was going to be decoupaging, and for that I'm using DIY's Crinoline. And the reason that I'm using Crinoline for the background of my decoupage paper is that it's a nice light neutral that will really help make the images on my decoupage paper stand out well. Once I was finished painting my blocks, it was time to move on to decoupaging them. Like I mentioned before, I'm using this beautiful paper by Redesign with Prima. I am not sure what the name of this one is, you guys. It's been in my stash for quite some time, but I really, really love it, and I thought it would be perfect for this project. So I cut out the pieces that I needed. I used my steamer to steam out any wrinkles, and then it was on to decoupaging. For my medium, I'm using DIY's clear liquid patina, and I'm starting by putting a good even layer of that on one end of my board, and then I'm just lining up my paper, laying it down, smoothing out that portion with my hand, and then moving my way down the board, adding more liquid patina, and then smoothing the paper out over it until I have the entire board covered. And then once I'm finished with that, I'm going to go over the paper with a pretty liberal coat of the liquid patina. I really like to add quite a bit to help make sure that all my fibers, are laying down nice and flat on my paper. Then I'm going to set this board aside and just work on the other two using the same technique. Once my decoupage medium is completely dry, I grabbed a piece of sandpaper. I believe this is 120 grit, and I am going around the edge of each board to sand off the excess decoupage paper. Just kind of using a downward motion here. You don't want to go back and forth because you risk ripping or tearing the fibers of your paper. Now, of course, this process does tend to expose some of the crinoline paint that was underneath the decoupage paper. So I like to go back around everything with a little bit more of that gravel road to just cover that up. So I'm very carefully going around the edges, just trying to cover up as much of that crinoline as I can. Once I was finished with that process, it was time to seal my gravel road paint, and for that I am using DIY's clear wax. I'm just going over the entire block, even the decoupage paper, with a coat of that clear wax, applying it with my soft bristle brush in a nice even layer. And then once I have the entire block covered, I'm going to take a shop towel and just very gently wipe back any excess wax. Now, I like going over the decoupage paper because it tends to soften it and really help to lay any fibers that might still be sticking up down, which I really, really love. At this point, my bases for my pumpkin blocks are complete, and it's time to start working on the embellishments. And I'm starting with some molds by Redesign with Prima. This one's called Imperial Intricacy. It's an older one, but I think I do actually have one of these in stock on my website. And then I am also using Soho Haven and Soho Fusion, I believe are the names. And unfortunately, these are no longer available. And then of course, to create my castings, I'm using amazing casting resin in white, which I also do carry on my website. Now for this set of castings, I wanted to create kind of an aged metal look, and I decided to start with a base color of DIY's Golden Ticket. I thought it would be nice to have a little bit of shine at the base, and I love the antique gold color of this. So I'm going in with 2 good coats of that liquid patina. Now, of course, this is a finishing coat, but it's a little bit thin, so I definitely needed the second coat for good coverage, but I absolutely love the finished result on this. Next, it was time to give these a little bit more depth and darkness and dimension. And I am going in with a little chip brush and DIY's Prairie Gray to achieve that. So I kind of want these to end up looking a little bit like aged bronze. And I thought this would be the perfect color for that. So I'm not really trying to paint the entire bit of these. Obviously, I wanted some of that gorgeous gold shining from underneath the Prairie Gray. So I'm doing kind of a dry brush technique, maybe a little bit heavier than technically a dry brush, but at any rate, I'm trying to get some paint on these castings, but not completely cover the Golden Ticket. When I was finished with that step, it was time to go back in and seal my Prairie Gray paint. And I'm starting with a coat of DIY's clear wax. And I'm using just kind of a pointed artist brush to really work that down into all the details to make sure that I hit all of that Prairie Gray paint with some of that wax. Now I'm not going to be wiping this back, so I'm just putting on a very thin coat and making sure that I spread it evenly all over my castings. I am mainly using that clear wax as a buffer coat for the next step, which is my dark wax. So once I'm finished with the clear, I'm going in with that same brush and some dark wax and getting that down into all of the details of these castings. And then I am wiping back some of that with a dry shop towel. Now, at this point, I'm pretty happy with how my castings are coming together. They may not look exactly like aged bronze, but they're pretty close, and I think they'll be perfect for my pumpkin block set. To glue my castings onto my blocks, I'm using Type Bond Quick and Thick, and I'm just putting a good layer on the back of each one. I use a little artist brush to kind of spread the glue out so that it doesn't squish out from underneath my castings when I put them down. But I do make sure to put enough glue on there so that they really stick well. Once I had all my castings in place, I went ahead and set my blocks aside for a couple of hours to let the glue set up before I moved on to my next step. Now for the next step, I'm going to be adding some metal embellishments that I found on Amazon. First are these really cool corner protectors that I am placing on each of the 4 corners on the 2 smaller blocks. They're a little bit tricky because the nails are really, really tiny and I have to hold them in place with my pliers, but I absolutely love the look. Then it was on to the tallest block, and for that one, I'm going to be adding these little triangular shaped embellishments to each of the front facing corners. And again, just holding those tiny little nails with my pliers while I hammer them in place. And then lastly, on the middle block, I'm adding a couple more of those triangular shaped embellishments. These ones are a little bit larger to the top and bottom, just above and below the casting. Then I decided to add just a little bit of Decor wax by Redesign with Prima. This color is called Eternal, to the castings and also to the metal pieces. This will really help to kind of tie everything together and also give it a beautiful hint of gold. Once I was finished applying the gold wax, the very final touch on the fronts of these blocks is going to be adding a little button to each of the smaller blocks where the holes in the castings are. So I'm just filling those holes with a little bit of glue and then adding these cute little buttons that I found at Hobby Lobby. The final step for my pumpkin block sets is to add the knobs or the stems to each one of them. For the two smaller blocks, I'm going to be using some ceramic knobs I bought at Amazon that did not come with any screws to attach them. Now, I was worried about just gluing the knobs to the top of the blocks. So instead of doing that, I found a dowel that would actually fit inside the knob, and I drilled holes into the blocks and added some glue and then the dowel. And then I added a little bit of glue inside the knob as well, and then set it down over the dowel. I figured this would give it a lot more stability than just gluing the knobs directly to the blocks. For the largest of the blocks, I'm using a knob that I found at Hobby Lobby that actually came with a screw. So for that one, all I had to do was drill the hole and then seat my knob down into it. Then my little pumpkin block set is complete, and I have to say, I love how they came out. For my second set of pumpkin blocks, I am going to go in a little bit of a different direction, and I'm going to try to get a chippy look. So I'm starting with some spray paint. This is Rust-Oleum 2X in Espresso, and I'm putting a really good coat of that paint on both sides of my blocks. Once I was finished spray painting my blocks, I brought them inside and let them dry for just a little while. I still wanted the paint to have just a touch of tackiness before I put down my milk paint. Now, since I am going for a crackly or chippy finish, I did not add any extra bond to my paint, and I'm just quickly going over these boards with a good even coat of that milk paint, trying to get them done before that spray paint dries completely. The color I'm using here is, again, that beautiful creamy, and once I am finished painting the front and sides of my blocks, I am hitting them with my hairdryer to really help encourage some crackle and some chippiness. I find that as that spray paint underneath dries, it expands, and that really seems to help create a lot of crackle. Then I quickly flipped my boards over to do the same to the back sides, just trying to get as much paint on as quickly as possible before that spray paint dries. I know it's almost impossible to see in the video at this point, but I'm starting to see some beautiful crackle as I am drying my boards here. Once I had the first coat down, I went ahead and went over all three of them with a second coat of that creamy paint. You can see the coverage is so much better with that second coat. And I find that once the first layer underneath has some crackle to it, the top layer is almost guaranteed to crackle as well. So I wasn't too worried about being in a hurry with this coat. You can see here all of that beautiful crackle that I'm getting. Once that second coat of paint was completely dry, I grabbed some sandpaper and went over all of my boards, starting with some 120 grit, just to really knock off any chips that might have formed and to do a little bit of distressing around the corners and the edges. I went over all three boards with that, and then I did go over them as well with some 220 just to make sure everything was nice and smooth before moving on. I did wipe off the sanding dust before I moved on to the next step, which is sealing my paint. And for this, I am starting with a coat of DIY's clear wax. And I'm just applying that again with my soft bristle brush, just making sure to get a nice even layer over all the sides of my blocks, and then wiping back the excess with a dry shop towel. Then to really enhance the crackle on these, I'm going over all of them with a coat of DIY's dark wax. I'm just adding that on with a little artist brush, wiping back the excess, and then before I move on, I'm actually going over each area with a little bit more clear wax to just help to remove some of that dark wax from the top surface of each of these blocks. I wanted my paint to have a nice patina to it, but I didn't want it to look too terribly muddy, and that clear wax helps remove just enough of it to give me the look that I really want. Once I had completed this step, I set my blocks aside to dry for a little bit while I moved on to the embellishments. I'm going to be using a very similar set of castings for these blocks, including the Imperial Intricacy and a couple of castings from the Soho Fusion and Soho Haven molds. Now to paint my castings, I am using DIY's Crinoline, mainly because I didn't want to have to mix up a teeny weeny little batch of Sweet Pickins Creamy. So I figured the Crinoline would be a close enough match with the dark wax over it that you really wouldn't be able to tell the difference. So I'm going over all of my castings with 2 good coats of that Crinoline paint. Once I had my castings painted, it was time to seal them, and for that I'm going in with DIY's clear wax, although as you can see here I didn't clean my brush very well, so it's technically kind of DIY brown wax, but it's still not quite as dark as dark wax would have been. So I'm just going with it and using that to go over all 3 castings, and then once I have that done, I'm actually going to go back in with a little bit of DIY's dark wax to really kind of sink down into all of those beautiful details in these castings and make them stand out. Once I was finished with my castings, it was time to glue them to the front of my blocks. And again, I'm just using that same Tight Bond Quick and Thick. I did measure to make sure that I had each of my castings centered, and then I set these aside for that glue to set up for a while. For this set of blocks, I decided not to reinvent the wheel, and I am just going in with the same placement of these metal embellishments on this set as I did the last. So the 2 smaller blocks get 4 corner protectors. The large block gets the 4 little triangular embellishments in all 4 corners. And then the middle block is going to get 2 of the larger triangular metal pieces, one on either side of the casting. At this point, I was really happy with how my pumpkin blocks were coming, but it seemed like the castings kind of disappeared a little bit, I guess, on the blocks. So I decided to add some gold gilding wax, but I wanted it to be a little bit darker, more like a bronze color. And since I didn't have any bronze wax, I decided to add a little bit of dark and decrepit liquid patina to my gold wax, my eternal wax, to see if I could darken it. And it worked a little. It wasn't super dark, but it definitely made things a little bit better and made my castings stand out. So I went over my castings and the metal pieces. And when I was finished with that, I actually dabbed just a little bit of the Dark and Decrepit itself onto everything as well to darken it even further. Lastly, I used the same knobs on these blocks that I used on the last set, but for whatever reason, I didn't record that step. And then my pumpkin blocks were finished. I love how these came together, and I really hope you guys do too. From here for today, you guys. I hope you liked my projects and I hope you enjoyed today's video. What did you think of my pumpkin block sets? I know they aren't exactly traditional pumpkins, but I love that they kind of give the feel of a pumpkin without being overly fall, and they're just kind of a nice architectural, pretty elegant element that you can add to your decor. So hopefully you liked them as much as I do. Anyway, if you did enjoy today's video, please remember to give it a thumbs up. I so appreciate that. And if you haven't already, I would love it if you would subscribe to my channel, then just hit the little notification bell so you don't miss anything. And then of course, don't forget to drop a comment below and let me know what you thought of today's projects. Just a quick reminder too, I do carry a full range of DIY products here in my shop as well as on my website at www.theeclecticcottagespokane.com. I carry DIY paint and products as well as Sweet Pickins milk paint and products, along with Recycled Treasures decoupage papers and some redesign with Prima. So go check those out there. And then for next Friday's video, I already have one project that's kind of in the hopper. And I'm thinking I might switch gears and start making some Christmas things. So we'll see. Anyway, I hope you can join me Friday, hopefully Friday, for that video. Until then, I hope you guys have a fantastic week. Thank you so much for being here. I always appreciate it. And I'll see you back here on Friday. Bye.